In this lecture, I'll cover the introduction and the geological context of Japan's evolution as an island nation-state. On March 11th, 2011, Japan was hit by the biggest earthquake in its 2,000-year history, 9.0 on the Richter scale. The northern region of Japan, called Tohoku, shook violently for 3 to 5 minutes, and the tremors of the earth were felt all the way down through Tokyo and farther points south. The force of the earthquake was so great that it knocked the global axis off, tilted it by 6 inches, and it moved the main island of Honshu on the Japanese archipelago about 10 feet eastward towards the continental United States. There were 400 aftershocks of varying degrees of magnitude, and the earthquake that shook northern Japan was followed in a few minutes by a massive tsunami, which at its height crested as high as 130 feet to 133 feet, and it rolled into the Japanese coastline at speeds of 800 kilometers per hour, the speed of a jumbo jet aircraft. This tsunami, the wave of tsunami, devastated much of the coastline of Japan. It went as far inland as 6 miles and had the effect of a bulldozer destroying buildings, homes, and carrying cars, vehicles deep into the interior of Japan. There were 20,000 or more deaths associated with this natural calamity, 6,000 casualties, and 80,000 displaced families who are still displaced. 2011 will be known as the year of earthquakes, floods, and natural disasters. There were 20 earthquakes of a magnitude of 7.0 or higher recorded in 2011. Big ones in New Zealand, in Turkey, in Pakistan, even on the northeast coast of the United States, including Washington, D.C., and New York City, which seldom experience earthquakes. There were extensive floods in Australia, in the United States, Pakistan, India, and Thailand. Of all of the countries of the world, there is no country more prone, more vulnerable to natural disasters than Japan. There are earthquakes that occur very often in the course of a year, tsunamis, typhoons, floods, mudslides, and fires. In Japan, in 1923, Japan experienced another huge earthquake, Richter scale 7.9, which hit the area of Tokyo. It's called the Great Kanto Earthquake. And because of the lower building standards at that time, the Kanto earthquake led to more than 100,000 deaths, and again, a destruction of the infrastructure, physical infrastructure of the city of Tokyo. Why is Japan prone to such natural disasters? Well, the main reason is its geology. Japan is an island archipelago of more than 1,000 islands, of which 4 are the main islands on which the Japanese reside: Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu. Okinawa is also a 5th. This island chain sits on what we call the Ring of Fire. It is sitting on top of tectonic plates which are moving constantly. The Tohoku earthquake on March 11th took place above the Pacific plate, which is moving at a rapid speed towards Japan every year, 3.5 inches per year. And the movement of these tectonic plates gives rise to earthquakes and slippage in these tectonic plates. And every year, on average, Japan experiences 1,500 to 2,000 earthquakes a year. That means every day, somewhere on the Japanese archipelago, there are 50 or so earthquakes per year. None of them, of course, of the magnitude of the 9.0 earthquake in Tohoku, but still a very active ring of fire around the Japanese archipelago. The March 11th disaster was made even worse by a man-made disaster, which was the nuclear meltdown of the 6 reactors located and built in Fukushima, very close to the Pacific Ocean. What happened was that the earthquake shook these nuclear facilities. They shut down as they were supposed to, and the backup generators went into effect. But the cresting, massive tsunami, which came and rolled over the nuclear facilities, broke down the backup generators, and as a result, you had a serious problem of heating in the 6 nuclear reactors, and in effect, a nuclear meltdown in 3 of the 6 reactors, leading to hydrogen explosion and the release of radioactivity in the air. Japan has, on its territories, built 54 nuclear reactors. Today, there are only 11 of those reactors in operation. There have been plans up until March 11th of building 14 more nuclear reactors by the year 2030. This would raise the total energy produced by nuclear power to 50% of Japan's total electrical generation. This was one way that the Japanese government believed Japan could achieve a reduction of carbon emissions to which it had pledged itself in 2009. But as a result of the nuclear meltdown, which will take not just years, but decades to clean up, decontaminate, and decommission, Japanese public opinion is overwhelmingly opposed to any expansion of nuclear power, and indeed, the majority of Japanese today wish to see a contraction of Japan's nuclear power capability. Germany has decided to halt nuclear power altogether. In Japan's case, it's not clear where the country will be headed. But one of the interesting questions, out of many questions that can be asked about Japanese history, the Japanese experience, is why 6 nuclear reactors were built so closely together in a cluster, so close to the Pacific Ocean, and vulnerable not only to earthquake shaking, but also massive tsunami waves. Why indeed is Japan so reliant on nuclear power? That is a question that needs to be asked, particularly in view of the so-called nuclear elegy that the Japanese people have experienced. Japan is the only country which underwent nuclear bombing. The atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to an estimated 100,000 deaths and maybe another 100,000 of slow deaths over the course of a generation through sicknesses caused by radiation. So Japan has had experiences, episodes that no other country has experienced of nuclear exposure, nuclear radiation, nuclear bombing. And as a result, Japan's people have had an allergy to nuclear power, to nuclear weapons in particular. And this was symbolized in the government's proclamation of 3 non-nuclear principles. That is, no building of nuclear weapons, no assembly of nuclear weapons, no import of nuclear weapons into Japanese territory. So it's a fascinating question as to how Japan became one of the biggest generators of nuclear power for its energy needs in the post-war period, given the strong sentiment against nuclear power. And indeed, if you look at Japan, as we will through the next several lectures, it is a country of contrasts, of opposites, of contradictions and paradoxes. And in the course of these lectures, an interpretive look at Japanese history, Japanese politics, Japanese economy, and U.S.-Japan relations, I would like to focus on 8 paradoxes, 8 themes that run through the course of Japanese history. It's these 8 paradoxes that make Japan particularly fascinating for people to understand. The first is that Japan has been, without question, of all the major countries in the world, the most isolated and the most resource poor. Yet, it was the first non-Western country to industrialize. It developed a modern economy in the early 20th century, and it became, in the second half of the 20th century, a rising economic superstate. Indeed, many people around the world expected that Japan would displace the United States as the largest economy in the world. So a country with no natural resources to speak of, isolated for more than 1,000 years of its history, unlike any other country, became the first, outside of the West, outside of the United States and Europe, to industrialize and acquire a modern, advanced manufacturing infrastructure. And Japan accomplished this primarily through trade and made up for the lack of natural resources through becoming a major trading power. The second paradox related to this is that because Japan was isolated for so many years, it did not experience invasions from foreign forces. It was secure in its national security against outside attack because it was an island archipelago removed from neighboring countries by oceans. And this country, which lived in bucolic isolation for more than 1,000 years, managed to become, after it was open to the West, an industrial power and a military power. Not only a military power, but a power that conquered much of East and Southeast Asia. From 1931 to 1945, 17 years of military expansion. This period, Japan built an East Asian prosperity sphere, as they called it, a military empire, which was the biggest in the 4,000 years of Asian history. And it forever changed the course of Asian history in those 17 years. So Japan went from a potential colony of the West to an Asian colonizer of East Asia. And at its height, the military sphere of influence sprawled over 7.4 million square kilometers, one of the largest military areas of conquest in world history. A third paradox is that domestically, Japan has developed a culture of refinement, of elegance, of tranquility. You see this in tea ceremony, you see it in flower arrangement, you see it in Zen gardens. And yet this same culture of refinement gave rise to runaway nationalism, ultranationalism, and military expansion. So the paradox is how a country with such an elegant and tranquil culture and society could then be transformed into a country of military conquest and runaway nationalism. The fourth paradox is that Japan, which conquered much of Asia by 1943, became vanquished in 1944-1945, losing the Pacific War, accepting unconditional surrender, and then suddenly transforming itself overnight with the Allied occupation of Japan into a peace-loving merchant state, which forswore the use of military force in its diplomacy. So Japan has gone from isolation for over 1,000 years to military paroxysm from basically 1931 to 1945, to a peaceful merchant state which separates economic power from military power and has posed no threat to any of the countries in Asia or indeed around the world. The fifth paradox is that in being open to the West, due to the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853, Japan engaged in a long period of conflict and war with the West, particularly with the United States. And the bitter enemies of the Pacific War, the US and Japan, became, in the aftermath of the Pacific War, the closest of allies and friends. Again, this occurred virtually overnight. And the United States and Japan concluded a monumental security treaty in 1952 in which the United States pledged to defend Japan against outside attack. And this security alliance became the basis for a multidimensional relationship, a thick tie of interdependence between the United States and Japan, including economic, political, diplomatic, cultural, technological, and commercial interactions. This relationship became so important, so functional in the stabilization of the global security and economic system that Ambassador Mike Mansfield, U.S. Ambassador to Japan, called it the most important bilateral alliance in the world, bar none. It was for Japan in the post-war period, the second half of the 20th century, the basis for its economic reconstruction, recovery, and high-speed growth. And it became the linchpin for Asia for peace, security, stability, and post-war prosperity. Due in part to this dynamic and strong relationship, the United States and the West eventually triumphed over the Soviet Union in the Cold War in the late 1980s. The sixth paradox is that Japan, as a rising economic power in the second half of the 20th century, becoming the second largest economy in the world and seemingly on the verge of overtaking the United States, became in 1990 through today, 2011, the sick man of Asia. Its economy suddenly grew stagnant. The 5 and 6% growth rates per year slowed to 0 to 1%. It had serious problems of deflation, of bankruptcies, and of stagnation. And the economy of Japan has not recovered and has not grown at the rate that it's capable of growing at, say 3% of GDP, since 1990. So this is the sixth paradox of modern Japan. The seventh is that the post-war period saw the development of a mature democracy, arguably the most stable democracy in the world. One single political party, the Liberal Democratic Party, we call it the LDP, dominated Japan from basically 1955 to 2009, the longest period of single-party dominance over a modern parliamentary system in the world. And Japan, under this LDP domination, developed a coalition of powers, a center of power based on the LDP, the bureaucracy, and business and other interest groups. And Japan achieved impressive growth with this coalition of stable power. However, after a speculative real estate bubble burst in 1990, the Japanese political system seemed to lose traction, and there has been a void in leadership from 1990 to 2011, a period of economic decline. Japan has not been able to solve the economic problems that have afflicted it in this period of 20 plus years. And one of the main reasons is that there is a political gridlock, partisan gridlock, policy gridlock, incapacity to deal with the economic problems, the long-term economic structural problems facing the Japanese economy. The United States faces similar problems of political gridlock. So does Europe. So it is a condition during times of economic adversity that seems to be common through all capitalist democracies. And the eighth paradox that I would like to identify is that Japan, after the Pacific War, was a country of social dynamism, stability, adaptability, constantly changing in the face of its own development and changes around the world. However, since 1990, the period of economic stagnation, Japan's society has become rigid, it's become old, and it is shrinking. In the 1950s, Japan was one of the youngest societies in the world. By 2011, Japan had become the oldest society in the world. The 1950s Japan was a society of youth, energy, industriousness, competitiveness, and upward mobility. The Japanese achieved a level of equity in income and wealth distribution that was the envy of the world, much more equitable than the United States, even the Scandinavian states, and especially other states in the developing democratic world. But by 2011, this dynamic society had become old, complacent, declining, shrinking, downwardly mobile, with growing gaps in income and wealth between the groups of Japanese society. So how did this happen? Why did it happen? that stability became rigidity, that adaptability became inertia, and efficiency turned into inefficiency. These are thus the 8 fascinating themes and paradoxes in Japanese history and the Japanese experience. So let me turn next to the issue of Japan's geographic foundations. As I pointed out, and as you see in the PowerPoint, Japan sits on very active tectonic plates. These tectonic plates are called the fire rim of the Pacific. This ring of fire, as you see, runs from Japan through Southeast Asia. And because Japan sits on it, Japan is, as I pointed out, prone to more natural disasters than any other major country. Japan is a land of 1,000 nations, 1,000 islands. Its population is about 128 million today. There are 4 main islands of the Japanese archipelago. Honshu is the main island where Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and other big cities are located. And it contains 80% of the Japanese population. Kyushu, a southern island below Honshu, is another big area which contains only 11% of the population. And in total area, it covers 146,000 square miles, which is slightly smaller than the state of Montana and the state of California, but still bigger than Germany. It is a fairly sizable country in land space, but it is much smaller than the United States or continental Europe. Nearly 75% of the land is mountainous, forest, and only about 13% of the land is arable. Japanese people trace their ancestry to the Asian continent and through particularly migration of Koreans into the Japanese archipelago. Its population has grown rapidly since the beginning of the 20th century, as you see in this PowerPoint. It's gone from a country slightly larger than 40 million to a country of 128 million in the course of the 20th century. Very big population growth. If you compare it with Asia, Japan is relatively small compared to China, which has a population of 1.2 billion people, about 10 times the size of Japan. But Japan is much larger than other countries like Thailand, certainly Hong Kong and Singapore, but if you include Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia is a big country, but Malaysia, Burma, other countries, Japan is one of the larger, more densely populated countries in the Asian region. The population, as I said, has gone from being one of the youngest to the oldest in the country. And the percentage of people over the age of 65 years or older is about 25% today in the case of Japan. In the United States, it's probably around 16 or 17%. Japan is thus a much older society than the United States or most other industrial countries. The percentage of senior citizens is due to the increase in life expectancy among the Japanese. Today, the average male in Japan will live to be 79.64 years old. the average female in Japan will live to 86.39. Again, those are the highest life expectancy rates in the world. At the same time, Japan's fertility rate has declined sharply over the post-war period. And today, Japan has a fertility rate of 1.2, which is the second lowest in Asia, one of the lowest in the world. To keep a population stable, that is flat, no growth, no reduction, you have to have at least 2.0 or preferably 2.2 fertility rate, that is 2 or 2.2 people per woman in the society. But in Japan's case, it is well below sustenance. A 1.2 rate means that Japan is shrinking, and shrinking rather rapidly. Why is the fertility rate so low today? By the way, France, another country which has had low fertility rates, an advanced industrial state, has seen an increase through government policy. So it's possible that Japan may also increase its fertility rate in the future. But the reason it has fallen is that men and women are marrying at a much later age in life. It used to be in 1950 that women on average got married at 23. Today that age is 28.8. The male in 1950 got married at 25.9, and today the average age is 30.5. So there has been a fairly dramatic change in the age and also in the number of marriages that have taken place. There are many Japanese who are living as single adults, choosing not to get married. Marriage rates have dropped. Divorce rates have risen. And the combination of all those factors mean that Japan's population is shrinking. The population today is roughly 127, 128 million. By the middle of this century, 2050, if the fertility rate or the immigration rate don't change, Japan's population will shrink to 109 million. And by 2100, the end of this century, Japan will be a country of 64 million people, roughly half of the population today. So that is a sort of demographic profile, and again it raises some fascinating issues about Japan's future. Turning next to the geography again, I want to point out that, as I said earlier, only 13% of the total land space in Japan is arable, suitable for farming. Japan has abundant water and trees. It is surrounded by ocean. You cannot stand on any part of Japan, of Honshu, without being further than 75 miles to the ocean. It has therefore developed a thriving agrarian rice cultivating society. And it has received much of its sustenance and protein from the seas, from fishes that are caught in the oceans surrounding Japan. It has almost no natural resources to speak of, as I've mentioned. No oil, gas. It had some coal, but no longer. It has water, but it has been a huge importer of oil and gas, particularly from the Middle East. It also has relatively little in the way of minerals, copper, iron, zinc, and other precious minerals. And if you compare Japan as an island archipelago to England, to Great Britain has much more in the way of natural resources, particularly in energy, with large oil reserves in the North Sea and natural gas, coal, minerals like zinc, tin, limestone, iron ore, clay, and gypsum. So these are resources that Japan has lacked. And the way that Japan has compensated for the lack of natural resources and yet become an economic superstate is through trade. And if you look at the composition of exports and imports, you'll see that roughly 50% of Japan's imports are raw materials, energy especially, but other raw materials and food, whereas nearly all of its exports are manufactured goods. So Japan imports raw materials, it assembles, manufactures them, and it exports them. And that's the way that it has become an economic superstate. Let me point out also that Japan's geographic location right off of the Asian continent has been a major factor in the development of its modern history. Japan is located at its closest point to the continent, 133 miles from the south, Kyushu, to Korea. This 133 miles has given Japan, again, isolation from the rest of the Asian region that almost no other Asian nation has enjoyed. It is 510 miles from the closest point of Japan to China and 5,000 miles from Japan to North America. The waters around Japan are mild. They can be navigated easily. And you have a variety of straits that help Japan to have access to the markets overseas. So Japan has, through its geographic location, natural water access, not only to the rest of Asia, but to North America and South America and the rest of the world. The island isolation has meant that Japan has been safe from foreign invasion for over 1,000 years. The last attempt to invade Japan took place in the 13th century by Kublai Khan and the Mongols. The Kublai Khan Empire tried to invade Japan in 1274, and he brought 2 naval fleets, 1,000 ships, 140,000 soldiers to try to invade and bring Japan into the Mongol Empire. But with invasions of Japan, the total force required to achieve an invasion is often 10 or 20 times larger than the defensive force in Japan. And it's been very difficult for countries to mount that kind of assault on the Japanese islands. In case of Kublai Khan, his assault was beaten back not only by Japanese forces, but by the kamikaze winds that blew in suddenly and destroyed many of the ships in its naval fleets. So while the rest of the Asian region was colonized, Japan was not occupied by foreign forces until its defeat in the Pacific War in 1945. Basically, more than 1,000 years of no immigration, no foreign invasion, no international conquests by foreign powers. Again, this is a very sharp contrast to Europe, England, and the rest of the world. In terms of its agriculture, Japan has been a rice-cultivating, rice-producing state. Rice, as in rice cultivation in China, allows countries to have large, dense population bases. And it often requires cooperation among farmers, cooperation in terms of irrigation, sharing water, cooperation in terms of tools that are often shared within villages, and cooperation in planting and harvesting. So the society that took root in agrarian Japan was a densely populated village structure that was homogeneous, cooperative, consensus-oriented, and which basically governed on the basis of consensus and what was in the best interest of the village. In this society, a homogeneous society, Japan developed a value system based on shame rather than guilt, based on particularistic values rather than universalistic laws. In Christianity, you see the bestowal of the Ten Commandments onto Moses in the Old Testament. And what happened with the Ten Commandments in the West, in the Judeo-Christian region of the West, is that laws were developed on the basis of this Christian value system of universalism. Legal codes were developed, and these values and legal codes were universally applicable. In the case of Japan, the shame society developed out of Shintoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, and was a situationally oriented value system. That is, a value system which had ethics governing relationships among people. And the ethics really revolved around Confucian notions of filial piety, that is, loyalty and dedication to your parents. And that parental relationship of filial piety was applied to non-kinship relationships, non-family relationships, in the form of loyalty. There was obligation and honor that was built into the Japanese value system that grew up in rural Japan. So values were not absolute, they were not universalistic, they were relative, they were relational, they were contextual. And so this value system was one which was highly flexible, context specific, and one which lent itself to dealing with natural disasters. Natural disasters were expected, were common. There was an acceptance of fate. Shikataganai is the word that the Japanese often use, which means we have to make the best of it. There's a sense of resignation. There's nothing we can do about it. And so out of village Japan came a homogeneous, relational society that was flexible and capable of transforming into the requirements of industrialization. It's no accident that in the aftermath of the Fukushima disaster, the 9.0 earthquake and the massive tsunami, which knocked out the 6 nuclear reactors and sidelined about 15% of Japan's electrical energy generation, that the Japanese people voluntarily accepted a 15% reduction in their use of energy. So that in the heat of summer, the heat and humidity of summer, Japanese households, Japanese office buildings turned down the air conditioner or turned it off for periods of time and voluntarily achieved a 15% reduction in the use of energy. Only in Japan is that possible, in my view, in a large industrial society. It is because there is a sense of obligation to fellow Japanese, a sense of commitment to the national interest. And so for the good of society, Japan pulled together obligation, loyalty, cooperation, reciprocity. These values brought Japan together in the face of its natural calamity. So, to sum up the geography, the geographic foundations of Japan, let me repeat again. Japan has been isolated longer, in more systematic ways than any other major nation state. It has evolved as a distinctive, indeed a unique island nation. And the implications are fairly substantial. Japan has managed to overcome its poor factor endowments, its natural resource base, by trading and becoming a major economic state through the mechanism of trade. It has enjoyed natural security protection by being removed from foreign powers that might have invaded and occupied Japan. Its strategic location has given it access to markets overseas. And in the brief period of interaction with the outside world, Japan has evolved into a unique, homogeneous society, an agrarian society, rice cultivating, based upon consensus, upon collectivity interests, and upon cooperation. So this is a fascinating story of modern Japan, a nation unlike any other nation in the world, which has dealt with the challenges, opportunities, disasters, and crises in its own distinctive way.